Not that long ago, if you wanted to make a record, someone had to pay for you to go into one of these temples of technology called a recording studio. Cost and complexity kept all but the lucky few out of professional studios. The door cracked open in the 1980s with home recording, based on multi-track cassette tape, notably the Studio. By the end of the decade, home recording had morphed into digital audio workstations, recording environments based on hard disk storage on a computer. This revolution brought new people into recording, but it also created a whole new world of untrained recording engineers and acoustically untreated spaces. Today, a studio is not so much this as this. Although it's possible to fix anything digitally these days, you shouldn't underestimate the value of getting better quality recordings in the first place.
Unless you're working entirely from pre-recorded material with loops, samples, and plugins, at least part of your recording will probably involve one of these. And unless you like living in the equivalent of an audio cave like this, you'll need a pair of these. Anything that's recorded in a real space or is played back in a real space is affected by the properties of that space.
You also have to deal with extraneous noise interfering with your recording.
Like an airplane, a police car, the air conditioning system, and so on. Plus the room in which you're listening to sound emphasizing or disguising certain frequencies or characteristics. This can lead to your recording or final mix of a track being based upon false information. A bit like commenting on the quality of a fine wine through a mouthful of a chocolate chip cookie. Cheers. The reason that's bad is because if you record music in a room that falsely emphasizes or reduces certain tonal or spatial characteristics, when you take it out of that room, the recording is going to be unbalanced. For example, too much or too little bass, or a mix that is too bright or too dull. If a recording only sounds good in the studio, then there's either something wrong with the studio, or something's wrong with the way the recording was engineered. Whatever your budget and what physical options are open to you, following these guidelines will help you get your recording off to a great start.
There's a saying that we kind of use around Orlex is that in the beginning there was perfect sound and then man created rooms. Low frequency sound waves are extremely long wavelengths for the time it takes to complete one cycle of the wave. So small rooms just can't reproduce low frequencies naturally. There's always going to be cancellations, buildups, all sorts of things that skew the response of the low frequency range. When outdoors you don't have that issue.
To put this in context, let's go over some of the principles of acoustics and how sound behaves. Sound is created by changes in air pressure transmitted to our ears by sound waves. The length and intensity of the waves govern a sound's pitch and volume. The shape of a wave determines its tone, and the characteristics of a wave determine whether we interpret that sound as simply a noise or something musical.
In the open air, as Gavin said, sound goes its merry way until the waves peter out, so the sound fades and then dies. But if sound encounters a hard and reflective boundary, it bounces back as an echo.
Hello?
In a room with hard and reflective boundaries like walls, floors, and ceilings, sound also bounces around, but not in quite such a discrete and obvious way. For this program, we've created a purpose-built recording environment from the ground up. It's not a multi-million-dollar studio, it's a relatively modest, multi-thousand-dollar studio. But we've looked at all the issues surrounding acoustics, in particular soundproofing or sound isolation. In other words, creating an environment where our music is not going to disturb the neighbors and a passing jet is not going to fly over our recording studio. We also look at absorption and diffusion. A good place to start is explaining these terms.
Isolation is literally separating your environment from extraneous sound and vice versa. Sound isolation equals soundproofing. Absorption is a little like how a sponge absorbs water, soaking up the sound waves so that they don't bounce back when they hit a boundary. When you absorb sound, you deaden it. Diffusion, on the other hand, is simply the redirecting of sound waves, breaking them up so that they don't produce undesirable artifacts, especially in a confined space like a home studio. Small rooms do pose special problems.
With smaller rooms, you run into things called room modes. And typically, room modes are really cancellations and buildups across the frequency range. Low frequency issues are a huge concern in small rooms, and this is due to the fact that low frequency wavelengths are much longer than most of the dimensions in small rooms. And so smaller rooms just can't reproduce that information as well as a larger space can. Typically you want to avoid dimensions that are divisible by the same number or each other. If you have rooms that are divisible by the same number, dimensions that are divisible by the same number, if you have a frequency problem at 80 hertz going side to side in that room, you're going to also have it going floor to ceiling, and then an octave higher going front to back. Well, anytime that you're getting into acoustical treatment for any space, you have to really assess what your problems are. One's the frequency domain, one is the time domain. So the frequency response of the room, how it represents different frequencies, and that's going to vary depending on the size of the room, the materials that are used in the room. A drywall room will react differently than a concrete room. Then there's the time domain as well, which is how quickly reflections come back to you. If you have a highly reverberant space, that can smear intelligibility, also can cause you to adjust your decision making during a mixing process, to where if you hear reflections coming within 50 milliseconds of the direct sound, your brain and the way you hear it actually factors it in as part of the direct sound. If it's within 50 milliseconds of the direct sound, reflections can be summed, essentially. You have to look at the frequency domain and the time domain.
If you have the chance to start from scratch, say convert an existing room or build a room within a room, as the production team has done here, there are a number of basic design and construction techniques you should be aware of, unless you have the money to pay a studio designer to do all the worrying for you.
It's really pretty simple. If you've got nothing but money, you can fix anything, and you can make anything as perfect as it can be. And oftentimes you have to cut a corner. You know, you might have to say, well, you're not going to have the isolation that you think you need. Sometimes they really don't need it anyways. If you really want that console or these speakers, or if you want the room to be this true or this kind of an ambience.
Before these specifics, let's look at what you really need in a studio environment. Possibly the single most important consideration when building a studio is to create an environment where you can trust the sounds you hear.
Essentially what you want to do is create a very consistent low frequency response at the mix position in a control room. If you happen to be sitting in one of those cancellation points around 60 or 70 or 80 hertz, that's right in the kick drum range. And so if you're sitting in a cancellation and you cannot hear that frequency very well, you'll keep boosting it until it sounds good in your room. But your room's really lying to you, because that's not how it was recorded. It's just how your room sounds. And so after you've adjusted it and boosted it, and then you burn a CD and take it out to your car, practically all you can hear is the kick drum. And that's because you've artificially boosted the low frequency range to compensate for your room problems.
You also don't want sounds from outside invading your mix. You need the room to be isolated from the outside world, from both sounds coming in and getting out, so you can work when you want, how loud you want.
Isolating sound is still only part of the picture. Equally as important is how sound behaves within your studio. A studio shouldn't be a dead-sounding space with no reverberant qualities. An orchestra might want an acoustic more like a church. While a rock band might look for something more like a club-like acoustic. Traditionally, the studio's performing area and control room were separate rooms with their own acoustic characteristics. For most people nowadays, the control room and the recording studio are one and the same place. A completely dead room with no reverberant characteristics would be very claustrophobic, like recording in a closet. Ideally, you want a room that's comfortable to work in audio-wise and atmosphere-wise, and also a room that offers you some kind of flexibility. In other words, that can be fairly dead in some areas, say when you want to record a clean vocal, but quite lively and inspiring in others, say when you want to record an acoustic guitar. A few years ago, the phrase live end, dead end started to be used, which describes a room that has different